That night, Elizabeth stood at the north end of Paradise, watching as the surviving invaders, now prisoners, were taken before Elijah. A large group of defending soldiers led them down the north tunnel into the dark. Elizabeth herself didn't dare follow. Somehow this felt personal, private. It wasn't her place to observe. Yet she couldn't help wondering what might happen. How might these mice react to the old hedgehog? What might his judgment be? And what might he do if he judged the prisoners untrustworthy? A small yet incredibly vocal part of Elizabeth relished the possibilities. The sound of metal ringing against the cobblestone interrupted Elizabeth's thoughts. She looked over her shoulder to see Monster approaching, a very grim look in his eyes. As he drew alongside Elizabeth, Monster looked ahead to the yawning void that led down to Elijah's chamber. Then he looked back to Elizabeth, his brow furrowing as he examined her expression. Elizabeth gulped. She didn't like what she saw in Monster's eyes. She sensed an overwhelming disapproval in them. Elizabeth looked away. She had a feeling she knew what was coming. Despite having confronted serpents, centipedes, an insane super rat, and even a giant gangster, she found the opinion of a friend to be the one thing her courage couldn't hold out against. "Are you pleased?" Monster finally spoke. Elizabeth shook her head.
No, of course not. Men are dying. Good men.
Monster grunted. After a time he added, "I'm pleased that Matthias' men arrived before you could finish him." Elizabeth looked up at Monster, an eyebrow raised.
I could have cut them off, you know, from their owl.
At what cost?
An evil man's life, of course.
Perhaps. Monster scraped absently at the ground with his strange new weapon. But much more at the same time. Do you know what it's like to kill a man?
Of course,
Elizabeth answered.
I slew Jormungandr, remember?
Monster nodded. Indeed. But there is a difference between killing a man and a beast. The latter is natural. The former a perversion. It deadens a part of the soul. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow as she listened, somewhat skeptical.
How would you know? I've never seen you kill a mouse, or even a rat, for that matter.
Monster answered Elizabeth's look with a harsh, furrow-browed stare of his own. Have you ever wondered why? Elizabeth shrugged.
Because you're not a killer. Not really.
Not anymore, no, Monster growled, looking away. If I told you how my mother died...
She tried to kill you, right?
Elizabeth answered.
And you defended yourself.
At the cost of a piece of my soul, Monster concluded. Yes, it was in self-defense. Yes, she drew first blood. But the price remained the same. This was why I said no when you asked me to teach you to fight. Elizabeth nodded.
I remember. It was just before...
Her voice trailed off.
Adam.
And Jormungandr, Monster added. The two fell silent for a time. Elizabeth thought back to the nightmarish ordeal, and she gasped.
I can't feel anything.
Elizabeth clutched at her heart.
I feel... numb. Why do I feel numb?
Only you can answer that, Monster answered. Perhaps the passage of time has dulled your pain. Elizabeth shook her head.
No. No, I can't accept that. I have to feel something after Adam.
Elizabeth's words died in her throat. I want you to stay back from the fighting, Monster rumbled. I don't know if it will do any good, but I don't want you fading any further.
Fading?
Elizabeth repeated, blinking.
What do you mean, fading?
Monster's brow furrowed. Elizabeth Hartley is kind, loving, and tender. She is not vengeful, and she does not hate. That is the friend I have treasured. That the woman to whom I swore my loyalty. But of late I have seen something else wearing her face, speaking with her voice, and I don't like it. So I warn you, whatever this thing is, be wary it does not overtake you. Elizabeth gulped.
Monster, are you threatening me?
No. Monster shook his head. I could not raise my hand against you, but I will warn you. I think there is more at stake here than our lives. Guard your soul, old friend, lest it slip away as you grow distracted. With that, Monster set a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, his grip closing like a vice, and he forcefully ushered her back to the plaza, where the other civilians waited, as did the rest of her circle. With every step, Elizabeth found herself replaying Monster's words through her mind. Up until now, she had always valued his opinions and his insights. And besides, he was right. Elizabeth could see something growing in her heart that left her shaken every time she looked at it. Astrid sat alone on a bench at the edge of the plaza, whittling absently on a twig. She had no audience at this time, nor did she have any more stories to tell. The recent bloodshed had sapped the citizens' enthusiasm for tales of adventure and heroism. More appealing to all of them were the more peaceful of pursuits, the composition of poems, works of art, and little contests of skill and intellect. In other words, anything that provided a non-violent outlet for their fears and pains. Even Astrid, who once dreamed of action and adventure, now found herself dreaming of a peaceful little hole in the ground, a warm place where she could curl up with a hot drink in one hand and the other holding a loved one close. When Astrid caught sight of Elizabeth and Monster returning to the plaza, she dropped her twig and sheathed her knife and bounded up to meet them.
"Hey,"
she greeted.
"you two got a moment?"
Monster looked to Elizabeth, his eyebrow raised, prompting her for a response. Elizabeth sighed and nodded.
Yes. It looks like I'll have a great many moments, in fact.
What is it? Monster asked. Astrid grinned.
"I was just thinking. There's a cat out there who wants to see Elizabeth, right?"
Elizabeth paled. Yet again she had a feeling she knew where this was going.
Yes?
"They seemed to know you.
Astrid explained.
Even respected you. I was just thinking, maybe we could convince them to join us. There's a ton of mice out there in the open just for the picking. The cats get easy prey, and we don't have to fight. Monster won't have to kill anyone. Everyone wins."
Astrid glanced between Elizabeth and Monster.
"Well, how about it?"
Elizabeth gulped. The suggestion reminded her of Jormungandr and the Commune. It wasn't a prospect she cared to pursue.
So, you're saying we should sell ourselves to predators for protection, just like Matthias?
Astrid shook her head.
"No, of course not. We won't worship them or mingle our spirits with them like Matthias does. It'll be more like a mutually beneficial arrangement."
Wouldn't that defeat the purpose of paradise?
Elizabeth countered.
If predators know we're here, it isn't hidden anymore, is it?
Aha! But that's why we won't tell them about paradise.
Astrid snapped her fingers.
All the cats need to know is that there's a very large group of mice ripe for the picking. We lead them to Matthias. The cats take care of our enemies, and maybe they'll even bring down the Bulba.
Monster rubbed his chin in thought. A tempting prospect, I admit.
I know it's a long shot,
Astrid added.
but if we can pull it off...
No!
Elizabeth interrupted.
Out of the question.
I beg to differ.
Astrid insisted.
If a pack of cats can defeat our enemies, then the people here in paradise, might who refused, might I add to hand you over to Matthias, won't need to shed any more blood. No one else needs to die defending us.
Elizabeth looked up at Monster for support.
We can't consider this. It's just so wrong.
Monster shook his head. I understand, Elizabeth Hartley. I do. But I am inclined to agree with Astrid. Still, it is up to you. It was you, after all, who Ivar One-Eye wished to meet. Therefore, I can urge you all I like, but this will have to be your choice. Yet even as Monster spoke, he could see Elizabeth slowly shaking her head, in horror and disbelief, eyes welling with tears.
No. They killed everyone. They leveled our houses. They murdered 8 entire families. My neighbors, my friends, people I had known since I was a child. And since they were children I had taught. Oh, no, monster. Please, please don't ask me to do this.
Monster heaved a sigh and nodded. All right, then. Looking to Astrid, he added, It's decided. There's nothing more to be done about it. Astrid, however, crossed her arms, far from satisfied.
Okay, fine. But Elizabeth, let me remind you, my family was also killed by these cats. My neighbors also eaten. So do what you like. Just don't feed me any excuses. I'm willing to give a little to help these mice protect themselves. Are you?
Elizabeth met Astrid's gaze, yet her own stare failed her. Elizabeth was the one to blink and turn away. She left Astrid and Monster, choosing to slip away through the crowds of mice. Astrid moved to follow Elizabeth, but Monster stopped her with a firm hand on her shoulder. No, Monster shook his head. This is something Elizabeth has to work through alone. Despite her many recent reunions with so many old acquaintances, and despite having found a new community to call home, Elizabeth could hardly remember feeling nearly as alone as she did at that moment. She felt as though Edge of the Gorge had just been destroyed again, and she had just awakened back in the gorge, battered and bruised from her fall over a ledge onto a bed of pebbles. As Elizabeth walked among the mice of paradise, her new neighbors and possibly new friends, children to be taught and their parents, visions swam through her mind of the dead, her old friends and neighbors, sheltering in their homes as the cats rampaged through their village. She imagined the children crying out as their roofs caved in under the weight of giant paws, as the village's meager defenses gave way. It occurred to Elizabeth that this might happen again. On the surface, Matthias and his followers would be regrouping, preparing new plans to assault and besiege Paradise. On the south side of the plaza, Peter had set up a triage, where he worked with the aid of Matrix and a number of Paradise's women to tend to the wounded. There they bound wounds, set bones, and collected blood from those beyond help for transfusions. As Elizabeth walked among them, almost in a trance, she saw the mice from both sides, all maimed, all in pain. Wandering into an empty part of the city, Elizabeth sat on the ground and leaned against a tower. She thought back, remembering. In her mind she could see old enemies. Dr. Chuckles, weeping from anguish as he cackled to keep the pain at bay. She pictured Matthias, every bit as obsessed with vengeance as the mad lab rat. She saw the moments they went wrong, chances for redemption, rejected in a moment of weakness. Then Elizabeth saw herself. She saw herself burying her pain as Monster had once advised, ignoring it as she walked her lonely road, while her rage silently festered day after day, poison coursing from her heart through her veins. Just like the others before her, Elizabeth saw her moment come, her choice. She understood. Everything made sense. Elizabeth found it nothing short of humbling as she saw herself in the faces of her enemies. The veil of tears faded from her eyes, and Elizabeth saw her decision as clear as day. She headed east, for the site of her battle with Matthias, and the spot where she dropped her sword. The ground there hummed with energy, each weapon still far too heavy to lift, but they could be moved. Taking her sword by the hilt, Elizabeth dragged it across the ground, until the magnetic field gave way. Then she returned the sword to its sheath and turned back to the north. Her cloak flapped in her wake as Elizabeth rushed back into the plaza. It waved behind her like a flag as she weaved amongst the crowds, back and forth. Many sets of eyes followed her, drawn by the sudden motion. Some were resentful, and Elizabeth didn't blame them. She had taken their friendship for granted, abused their hospitality. But now Elizabeth would make that right. Elizabeth found Don near a fire, sharpening his collection of knives against a white-hot stone.
Excuse me, do you have a moment?
Don nodded, sparks flying from a blade as he scraped its edge against the rock.
Yeah, what is it?
I'm going to accept Ivar's invitation.
Don froze. His knife slipped from his hand and clattered to the ground at his feet.
Your what?
Astrid made a very good case for it,
Elizabeth added. Don puffed at the edges of the blade, cooling it before returning it to its sheath.
Liz, you know who we're talking about, right? The cat that killed our people?
I said the same thing,
Elizabeth admitted.
but
But what?
Don snapped. Elizabeth locked eyes with Don.
we can't cling to our hate forever. It will kill us from the inside, turn us into the very thing threatening paradise.
What? And bargaining with predators won't?
Are you with me or not?
Don paused for a time in thought.
If I say no, will you get someone else to go with you?
Elizabeth shook her head.
I won't force Monster to fight other mice, and I won't put Will or Ben at risk.
Don rolled his eyes toward the ceiling and shrugged with a helpless sigh.
Then I guess I have to say yes. But if you ever do anything like this again...
Don shook an accusing finger at Elizabeth.
So help me. I'll just have to say yes for the umpteenth time. Blast it.
Elizabeth giggled softly.
Well, the cat that met us said Ivar was waiting, south of the green. I'm guessing that means the park, topside. So I plan to take the south exit.
Yeah, I get it.
Don heaved a frustrated sigh.
Okay, fine. When do we start?
Now.
Don doused the last of his daggers in a bucket of water, and slipping it into its sheath, he seized up his longbow and set off after Elizabeth to the south. In the entry chamber, Don helped Elizabeth pick her way past his tripwires so as not to give a false alarm. Up and up they climbed, to the hatch leading to the surface. Don took the lead, opening the door just a crack as he peered out. Seeing no mice nearby, he opened the door a bit further, and finally flung it wide.
All clear,
Don announced.
but I'm seeing fire up north. Looks like some kind of celebration. I'm going out on a limb and guessing that's bad.
Elizabeth emerged behind Don, nose twitching as she gazed into the distance.
Eventually, it might be, but right now it just means we can slip away unnoticed.
Don raised an eyebrow, glancing Elizabeth's way.
If you say so, Liz.
Don closed the door, as quietly as he could manage. Covering it over with a layer of sod, he then led Elizabeth into the deep grass. Both mice kept a wary eye skyward, scanning the starry void for movements. An owl, it is said, makes no sound in flight. Therefore, the only way to know its approach is to see it.
We're okay.
Elizabeth eventually whispered, pointing towards a distant tree overlooking a towering bonfire.
There she is.
Xibalba was perched on a high bough, looking down on the gathering of mice below. Her eyes were focused on her allies, her ears aware only of Gustav's voice as he gave a speech to the others. A great sensation of scorn rose within Xibalba's breast as she looked upon Matthias, hunched at the edge of the gathering, a once great mouse reduced to a frightened old man. Elizabeth and Don slipped under the fence, scurried across the sidewalk beyond, and dropped into a gutter at the side of the road. Two sets of ears perked up, listening intently to the night. Don climbed the curb to check for signs of pursuit.
I don't think we were spotted,
he whispered down to Elizabeth. From there, the two mice scampered to the cover of a hulking metal behemoth, a machine of the great apes, often seen carrying them from place to place. Now it was silent and motionless, as dead as the city around it. From there, Elizabeth and Don fled across the street, hair standing on end as they felt the empty air press down against their backs. Elizabeth, for her part, could not reach the shelter of a machine on the opposite side nearly soon enough. Don heaved a sigh as he felt the shelter of the vehicle pass between him and the open sky.
Well, hard part's over. Where now?
The cat mentioned wooden steps.
Elizabeth mused.
The next question is, how many wooden steps are there?
Many, came an answer from under the far edge of the machine. There, Elizabeth and Don spotted a large, fiery orange face, a bright amber pair of eyes set into the silky, furry brow. "But I can guide you to the correct ones."
You!
Elizabeth recognized the cat that had approached her earlier. "Ragnar Half-Fang, son of Ivar One-Eye." The cat introduced himself with a nod. "At your service."
Yeah, just one problem.
Don spoke up, stepping between Elizabeth and the cat.
How do we know we can trust you?
"My father has ordered your safety," the cat answered. "I am honor-bound to obey."
In that case,
Don flashed a smirk Elizabeth's way.
we've got an army of enemies after us. Why don't you cats do something about that?
"Not my call to make," Ragnar answered. "I, for one, would turn you down. But this is my father's decision. You'll have to talk to him. That is your purpose in venturing into our territory. Correct?"
It is.
Elizabeth answered. The cat's face vanished from view as he retreated back onto the sidewalk. "Then come with me. I'll show you the way."
Well,
Don asked, exchanging an uneasy look with Elizabeth.
what do you think? Should we?
Elizabeth nodded.
He already had a chance at us this morning. I think we can believe him when he says he won't harm us.
Several other cats had gathered by the time Elizabeth and Don emerged from their hiding place. Large eyes stared down at them from within a diverse array of faces, yet not one cat made a move for either of the two mice. "This way, little ones," Ragnar spoke up. The fiery cat led off to the right, down the sidewalk to a forbidding wooden castle. Just a house to the great apes, but to the two mice approaching it, it resembled a towering citadel. A series of giant steps led up to the front door, the space underneath shrouded in blackness. As Ragnar approached, he called out, "Father, they've come!" Then Elizabeth saw it, snapping open in the dark. The vision from that awful night so long ago. The thing that haunted her nightmares whenever her dreaming mind drifted back home. A single green eye, flecked with streaks of brown and red. Elizabeth couldn't help a sudden gasp as she stared into it. It felt like only yesterday she had first run from it. There was a flash of white in the dark, the white of long, spear-like teeth, as the cat opened his mouth to speak. "Welcome, Scarlet Lady. I am most honored."
I'm not here to honor you.
Elizabeth spoke up. "No, of course not." The eye rose into the air, accompanied by the clicking of claws against the cement as Ivar forced his legs under him. As he stepped from the shadows, the light of moon and stars spilling across his ebony hide, Elizabeth let out a gasp. Ivar was a cat like no other she had seen. His paws were enormous, almost the size of a small dog's, his long, curving claws protruding from the ends of his toes, unable to quite retract all the way. "But I am honored all the same." The cat sat back on his haunches, towering above mouse and feline alike. "Tell me, Scarlet Woman, why then have you finally come?" Elizabeth gulped as she gazed up at the battle-scarred face of Ivar One-Eye and the tips of fangs protruding from under his mangled lips.
I've come to bargain.
"I do not bargain," Ivar answered. "I conquer, and take what I please from among the conquered." Elizabeth couldn't help a shudder at the cat's words. However, a quick breath was all she needed to gather her wits.
So, you wouldn't be interested in a large group of mice out in the open, ripe for the taking?
"I would not." Ivar tilted his head to one side, his eye narrowing. "But I would be interested in knowing why a mouse would betray her own kind to me."
They aren't our kind.
Don burst in.
They're our enemies, and they want Elizabeth dead.
Ivar raised an eyebrow. "Do they really? Foolish little creatures, fighting amongst themselves when there are greater enemies to fear."
They blame me for the destruction of their commune.
Elizabeth admitted.
A commune that you and your sons wiped out.
Ivar rumbled. It sounded almost like a laugh.
Do they really? And how does a mouse drive the Felidae to act?
The commune was protected once,
Elizabeth explained.
by a snake. The mice would offer it tribute from among their number in exchange.
Ivar wrinkled his nose in distaste, baring his teeth in a snarl.
Then it is fortunate my sons and I laid waste to their homes. If a man save his life by sacrificing his brothers, then his own be forfeit.
So say we all, a chorus of cats chimed in.
I'm glad we see eye to eye.
Don remarked.
No offense.
Then you'll come?
Elizabeth asked.
And, you know.
We will not.
Elizabeth fell silent, blinking.
Why not? Didn't you say their lives were forfeit? That they deserved death?
It is not our place,
Ivar answered.
My sons do not hunger, and I can no longer eat. Therefore, if we were to kill your enemies, it would be without need. There is no honor in that.
No honor?
Elizabeth repeated. Her face grew hot with a rush of anger.
And when you murdered my friends, my neighbors, women, children, entire families, you think there was honor in that?
We are Felidae. We must kill to live. It is our nature. There is no shame in obeying one's nature.
Elizabeth's mind spun in a whirlwind of fury. She struggled to keep her priorities straight as the utter injustice of it all got to her.
You killed everyone I knew, everyone I cared about. You have a chance to make it right now.
With more death?
Ivar raised his eyebrow, his terrifying eye growing wider with the motion.
Death cannot undo death, Red Lady. Killing your enemies won't bring your friends and neighbors back.
But you can save new ones,
Elizabeth countered. She immediately regretted it, for she had just given away the secret of paradise, and to predators no less.
Irrelevant.
Ivar's brow relaxed, his eye narrowing slightly with the motion.
I have no quarrel with these new neighbors of yours. I have caused them no harm, and therefore have no debt to settle.
But you owe me!
Elizabeth shouted, the last edge of her cool slipping away.
You took everything from me.
Ivar shook his head.
You still have your life. I didn't take that. And with it you have forged a new spirit, new strength and new vigor, which never would have been yours had I not driven you to action. Far from robbing you, I have given you a gift. If either of us owes the other a debt, it is you who owe me.
Elizabeth felt as if she had been struck a physical blow, and had the wind knocked from her lungs. She silently seethed with impotent outrage, unable to put it into a coherent thought.
But you killed so many.
Ivar nodded.
I have killed many mice. My debt is to them, not to you, and that debt will soon be paid. But I owe you nothing, for I have done no harm to you.
Elizabeth was utterly dumbstruck. The cat spoke nonsense, and it took Elizabeth time to process and respond to such nonsense. At last, she managed to sift through the outrage and find some semblance of reason.
If they're dead, how can you pay a debt to them?
They have returned,
Ivar answered.
The spirits of the conquered have possessed my flesh and turned my own body against me. Each day I suffer for the lives I have taken, and I have taken many. Such is the fate of all Felidae. Behold!
Elizabeth winced as Ivar bent towards her, his jaws gaping. A massive blob of malformed, bloated flesh sat at the back of his mouth, gouged dozens of times over by the cat's long fangs, streaked with wounds fresh and old, many of which were discolored with infection. At last Ivar closed his mouth and backed into the shadows.
I can no longer eat. It is too painful. My ears ring with the call of the honored dead. This is why I wanted to meet you. I have spent my life hunting your kind. I have seen many of them in battle, and they fell with courage and valor. I have nothing but respect for your people. Before it ends, I wish to know one of them in peace, as a friend."
Elizabeth let out a sharp breath, a look of intense disgust oozing across her face.
Friend? You killed my people. You refused to help me in my hour of need. And you say you want to be friends?
"It is hours such as these in which legends are born,"
Ivar explained patiently, as if to a spoiled child. Elizabeth didn't like his tone in the least.
"My sons and I still sing of the valor of your people. We did not destroy them. We made them immortal. Your people conducted themselves with honor and earned themselves a place in the hallowed halls of our fathers."
Ivar paused, snapping his jaws for a moment, and giving off a sickening, squelching sound as his teeth squeezed against his tumors. At last he went on.
"As to your current trial, it is a time of opportunities, a chance to test one's strength and courage. In this hour you may show your heroism and seize immortality for yourself. It would be wrong of me to take that from you."
Elizabeth silently glared back up at Ivar. Her chest rose and fell with a frenzy of breaths, expelling steam from her nostrils in the chill night air. Words alone could express neither her disappointment nor her anger. The only thing that could come close was the look in her eyes, a glare so cold it had often been said it could turn fire to ice.
Come on, Liz.
Don spoke up, squeezing Elizabeth's shoulder.
We're done here.
Elizabeth's gaze rested on Ivar for a long time, even as she turned away. The cat shrugged, and with a swish of his tail he returned to his place under the steps. However, as Elizabeth crossed the sidewalk, returning to the street, she heard Ivar's voice call out a final time.
"Elizabeth Hartley, show your valor! Do so, and whether you win or lose, I promise I will personally guard your new village for 10,000 generations. That is my offer."
There were any number of things Elizabeth could have said in response. Questions she could have asked, criticisms she could have voiced, but she was tired and disappointed, and had no desire to waste her breath with the cat any further. Elizabeth was much slower on the return trip. Her heart was heavy. It weighed her down far more than an overstuffed belly after one of her famous binges. Don, by contrast, was agitated. He didn't like lingering in the open for extended periods, and Elizabeth's glacial pace forced him to do just that as the two made their way across the street. It wasn't the cats that concerned him. No, the felines had made their intentions more than clear. But there was still an owl about, and as long as the mice were exposed, they were at risk. As Don and Elizabeth slipped under the fence at the edge of the park, however, another flying enemy made itself known. A bright light flashed overhead, accompanied by the sounds of grinding gears and a multitude of metal blades slashing at the air. Elizabeth dove for the cover of a large root, followed shortly by Don. As the two mice peered over the edge of the root, they saw it land and its occupants emerge. It had been a drone, similar to the one that had previously been in contact with Matthias. A central structure, supported by 4 turbines that served to lift it into the air, as well as to steer it in flight. However, this one was much larger than the first. Each turbine measured a grown mouse's body length across, and the central structure resembled an enormous cube. As the flying vehicle's motors powered down, however, the mechanical whine of engines and hydraulics continued. The entire front wall of the structure tilted forward, not unlike a medieval drawbridge, and with many a metallic clunk, a towering figure stepped out. He had changed a great deal since Elizabeth last saw him, having replaced not just his right arm, but both legs with sharp, razor-like prosthetics. But there was no mistaking him.
Dr. Chuckles,
Elizabeth breathed.
You know this freak?
Very slowly, Elizabeth nodded.
Unfortunately, yes. But what's he doing here? Matthias and his mice hate lab rats.
Maybe they hate you more.
Don suggested.
Matthias, my good and dear friend, Dr. Chuckles boomed, his black trench coat flapping about his sides as he spread his steel arms in a gesture of mock affection. Where is Matthias? I've been waiting to meet you. Matthias has failed us, Gustav was heard to announce as he strode to the front of the throng. I lead these men now. I am... Gustav's voice died as a steel hand seized him by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Perhaps I wasn't clear. Yanking Gustav close, Dr. Chuckles bared his teeth in a menacing grin. I want Matthias! With that, he dropped Gustav to the ground, where the blacksmith lay coughing for a time. Where are you, little man? Step forward! Don't keep me waiting. A heavy silence fell over the gathering, as if every mouse there was holding his breath. Dr. Chuckles cracked his neck, tilting his head to either side. Then there arose a number of shouts, at first to the outskirts of the camp, slowly making their way towards the center. Here he is! We have him! Matthias was flung to the ground at Dr. Chuckles' feet. He winced in pain as he landed, and kept his gaze down, refusing to make eye contact with the rat. You disappoint me. Dr. Chuckles knelt beside Matthias and flipped the ancient mouse onto his back. For someone to lead a little army like this, and an owl to boot, I was expecting a little more spirit. As I said, Gustav spoke up, Matthias has grown weak and spineless. Now I lead these mice. We brought you Matthias, another mouse added. So what about these weapons you promised, eh? Dr. Chuckles looked up, a bright beam of light shining from behind a monocle squeezed into the bloated, cancer-ridden flesh around his left eye. The sudden glare sent the mice caught in its fiery light reeling in shock. As the light faded, Dr. Chuckles flashed a satisfied grin. Mr. Morden, Dr. Chuckles called, raising a knife-like hand. Sparks flew from his talons as he rubbed them together in a crude imitation of finger-snapping. Bring out the goods. A mouse emerged from the vehicle, carrying a rat-sized case in each hand. He cut a distinctive figure, wearing a black vest embroidered with silver, a Western-style Stetson hat, and a belt hung with twin pistols. Don grew tense and his brow furrowed as he recognized the figure of Saul Morden. Elizabeth could feel his skin grow hot against hers, and she noticed his knuckles turning white as his fingers curled into fists.
Don?
Elizabeth whispered.
Are you okay?
Don let out a sigh, relaxing somewhat at the sound of her voice.
I will be, eventually.
There was a light click as Saul Morden opened one of the cases, revealing its contents for all to see. Gustav approached the case first, an eyebrow raised in curiosity. What is it? The blacksmith asked. An arm, Dr. Chuckles answered, similar to mine. At this he lifted a mechanical hand, stretching and flexing his fingers to demonstrate. Once I tie it into a nervous system, it becomes every bit as responsive as the real thing, and it's stronger, more durable, and it never gets tired. At a gesture from Dr. Chuckles, Saul closed the first case, and opened the second. This next one is a thing of beauty, Dr. Chuckles began. I used it to destabilize the city rats, handing out one or two to a few low-level thugs. In a matter of days, they rose through the ranks and challenged the crowned heads of ratdom. Enough chatter, Gustav grumbled. What does it do? Watch and observe, Dr. Chuckles answered, taking the weapon and bracing it against his shoulder. Raising it high, he fired off a hail of bullets into the air, sending burning streaks flashing through the night sky, accompanied by a sound of thunder that carried for miles. There was not one mouse among the crowd that did not fling himself to the ground for fear of being struck down. It has gone by many names, Dr. Chuckles added, returning the weapon to its case. My personal favorite is the Chicago typewriter. Don and Elizabeth exchanged terrified glances.
This is bad,
Elizabeth whispered.
I've seen those things in action. We need to warn the others.
Not yet.
Don whispered back, grabbing Elizabeth by the arm.
There may be more where that came from. Whatever else that guy has, we need to know.
This is a rather fun one, Dr. Chuckles went on, producing a small paper tube from his breast pocket. It doesn't look like much, one of the mice remarked. This only prompted the mad doctor to chuckle. Where I come from, we have a saying. At this, he scratched the letters K, E, and Y into its side. You can open any door if you only have the key! Sparks flew from the fuse as Dr. Chuckles squeezed it between two talons. With a laugh, he tossed it into the crowd of mice, sending them scurrying, if only to get away from the embers. A deafening explosion rocked the park, leaving a crater in the midst of the mice, and draining the color from Dawn and Elizabeth's faces. And that, my friends, is the ultimate key. Great Odin's beard! Matthias exclaimed. This is monstrous! No mouse was ever meant to wield such power! Dr. Chuckles grinned. I know. Isn't it wonderful? It's terrifying, Gustav agreed. But it's no less than those cutthroats deserve. I'm glad you see it my way. Dr. Chuckles gave the blacksmith a mocking bow. I assume I've tickled your fancy? You have, Gustav admitted. But I have to wonder. Jormungandr and Xibalba received sacrifices to feast upon. What do you gain? Dr. Chuckles shrugged. That's quite simple, really. I get Peter Dane, and a very large number of new friends. Fair enough, Gustav mused, yet the way he eyed the strange rat suggested Gustav didn't quite believe him. No, it is not fair enough, Matthias shouted. Don't you see there will be a heavy price for all these things? Heavier than we've already paid, Gustav snarled back. Your words mean little, old man. Matthias winced, but fell silent. Now, Dr. Chuckles changed the subject. This is hardly a time to squabble amongst ourselves. We've a great deal to do. Gustav glared at Matthias for a time, but finally he nodded and looked away. Fine, let's do it. I'll take an arm, a mouse called out. I'll take 2 arms, another added. Can I get 4? Dr. Chuckles gestured to the first mouse. Since you'll be the quickest, let's begin with you, shall we? Step into my office. With that, Dr. Chuckles led the first mouse aboard his drone. The interior was dark and rusted, each wall piled high with crates. A tangle of wires hung from the ceiling, and a headset resembling a submarine's periscope protruded from among them. A dirty operating table folded out from the rear wall, and to this Dr. Chuckles motioned. Lie down, little friend. Relax. Yes, be sure to relax. The mouse glanced about uneasily, but did as he was told. So, what now? You just clamp it on, or... Now, Dr. Chuckles gripped the mouse's shoulder with one hand and his arm with the other. You sing. It helps me to concentrate. The mouse gulped, trying to think of a cheerful, traditional song from the old commune, before everything went sour. He began, his voice shaking at first, but slowly growing stronger as his confidence grew. Then, starting with a sharp, sudden high note, his song devolved into a chorus of screams. The mice outside shuddered at the sound of it. Gustav's eyes grew wide with horror. Matthias, however, simply shook his head. After several agonizing minutes, it was all over. Dr. Chuckles emerged, flicking his steel talons about, rust-colored stains newly appearing across them, and dark, oily droplets flying with each motion. Such a lovely, lovely voice. His patient appeared a moment later, visibly shaken as he staggered out, eyes wide in shock, his right arm replaced with one of the steel prosthetics, and streaked with black, oozing lines. Dr. Chuckles inclined his head, daintily raising his steel talons to either side, eager to continue operating. Next. The other two mice exchanged terrified glances, and then shouted in unison, "Cancel my order!" Matthias backed away from the scene, slowly shaking his head until he came up short against a solid wall of his former followers.
I can have no part in this! It's monstrous!
Vengeance is a monstrous business, Dr. Chuckles retorted. And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't vengeance exactly what you wanted?
Not vengeance, Matthias spat. Justice!
Jostling the mice behind them, he shouted,
Now get out of my way!
Yet not one of them gave an inch. I have seen your justice, Dr. Chuckles sneered, and it looks a very great deal like my vengeance. But let's put it to a vote, shall we? Looking past Matthias, Dr. Chuckles called out, Justice or vengeance?
They are the same,
Gustav barked. He was answered with a round of shouts, echoing the sentiment. At this, Gustav approached Dr. Chuckles and held out his arm, elbow first.
Give me one of your limbs. I'm not afraid. Then you are already lost,
Matthias answered in a low growl. Turning about, he addressed the other mice.
And what of the rest of you? Will you also partake of this abomination?
Not one voice answered him, and not one voice needed to. Matthias could see the answer burning in the eyes of his men.
Very well, then, Matthias shouted. So be it!
For just a moment, the ancient mouse appeared to contract into the ground like a spring, and then he hurtled upward and forward, his hind feet clawing and tearing at the two nearest mice's shoulders as he leapt over them. With a speed and agility unheard of for his age, he dashed across shoulders and heads, the crowd parting behind him like the Red Sea as the shocked mice regrouped in his wake.
Let him go, Gustav was heard to shout. He no longer matters.
There was, however, one creature among them that disagreed. Xibalba silently lifted from her perch and circled overhead as Matthias fled. Matthias could see himself through her eye, scurrying helplessly on foot as the owl dove for him. But then he saw an arrow. Xibalba spread her wings, abruptly halting in midair, and swerved aside, her memories still fresh from the time one of her eyes had been blinded by that same marksman. The owl wheeled away with a shriek, circling for another pass. Gustav darted to the front of the gathering of mice, rage flaring to life in his face as he pointed and gave a shout.
She is here!
Matthias looked toward the tree and saw a mouse standing atop a root, bow drawn and arrow nocked as he took aim for the circling owl. In Don's shadow, a second form rushed forward, that of Elizabeth Hartley. Matthias stared in disbelief as she held out her hand, eyes wide and earnest.
Come with me, quickly.
Matthias did not take Elizabeth's hand. He did, however, dart past her as Xibalba dove a second time. A second arrow whistled from Don's bow, driving back the owl once more.
Get them!
Gustav roared. He rushed to the newly outfitted mouse, still dazed from his ordeal at the hands of Dr. Chuckles.
You received new strength. Use it!
Gustav gave the mouse a rough shove, sending him staggering forward. The razor-armed mouse shook his head, sluggishly processing his surroundings. Then he laid eyes on the fleeing forms of Elizabeth and Matthias, and with a scream of murderous hate he was off, charging alongside his comrades and outpacing them all. Dr. Chuckles, for his part, leaned against the side of his craft, and grinned as he watched. Xibalba wheeled about, dodging arrow after arrow, while the re-armed mouse rapidly closed the distance between himself and Elizabeth. Dr. Chuckles cocked his head to the side, almost bored as he flipped open a panel on his right arm. Closer, closer drew the crackling talons of the distant mouse as he reached out for Elizabeth. Then there was a bright flash, a burst of cinders. The mouse shrieked, and he stumbled, tumbling face first into the ground. In an instant, Elizabeth and Matthias vanished into the wooden hatch. Don followed a moment later, and just like that it was over. Xibalba let out a furious shriek, her voice joined by hundreds of shouts and jeers from the mice below. Saul Morden shook his head at the spectacle, and looked up at Dr. Chuckles.
Now why'd you go and do that? They almost had her.
There was a click as the panel on the rat's arm flipped closed, and he grinned down at Saul. It was too soon, Mr. Morden. Much, much too soon. The metal-armed mouse twitched where he lay on the ground. It took 4 other mice to pick him up and carry him back to the campsite. As Gustav looked over the injured mouse, his eyes were drawn to a blackened section of the arm. Turning his fiery glare to Dr. Chuckles, Gustav pointed at his fallen comrade.
What do you know about this?
Dr. Chuckles shook his head, clicking his tongue in a somewhat patronizing manner. I'm afraid you were a little too eager. The arm requires an energy cell, you see, and the one powering it was for testing purposes only. You pushed him into battle before I could install a combat-ready cell. The one he had couldn't take the strain, and it failed. Gustav's brow furrowed in suspicion, but he lacked the technical knowledge to argue the point. At last he grumbled,
So fix it.
Dr. Chuckles nodded with a hollow grin, which spoke more of treachery than of friendship. Of course. Right away. Under the tree, Don lingered by the hatch, his ear pressed against it as he listened for the sounds of further pursuit. After a time he nodded to Elizabeth.
I guess they know better than to follow us into our den, eh?
As Matthias gasped for breath, he shook his head.
For now, perhaps, but with those unholy weapons they'll be emboldened.
Unholy?
Don repeated incredulously.
You're one to talk.
Matthias shot Don a dirty look.
I know your opinion of me, Copper, but I assure you there are far darker things in this world than I.
Elizabeth bit her tongue, swallowing the urge to argue. Don, however, didn't restrain himself.
So, what's your beef with tall, dark, and metal?
The fire faded from Matthias' expression, and he appeared to pale just a little.
That rat is tainted, touched by the great apes. His taint runs far deeper than any I have seen before. I believe he may nearly be an ape himself.
Okay, problem solved.
Don grinned.
We bribe him with a ton of bananas and we send him on his way.
Don was answered with 2 very annoyed looks from the others.
What?
Let's go.
Elizabeth changed the subject.
The others need to be informed.
You better stay behind us.
Don remarks to Matthias.
Let everybody see us first, right? Try to ease the shock a bit.